Hey everybody, today on the Miller Group Real Estate Show, we will be taking a look into how local condominiums will be impacted in the wake of the Surfside condo collapse. This will be a multi-part series that will span 3 or 4 episodes on the show. Part 1 is today's interview with Jason Hambrecht of CSI Engineering. Jason is the go-to local source for condominium associations when addressing aging infrastructure and preventing a buildup of deferred maintenance. In today's show, we deep dive into what condominiums can do to ensure their buildings are safe and sound. We review the most common areas of concern that Jason sees in Amelia Island condominiums and discuss what association boards can do to address these concerns. Before we get to the interview, though, I wanted to give a quick update on the Amelia Island real estate market. If you haven't paid attention, inventory is drastically low, demand is strong, and prices are getting higher by the day. In many cases, prices are significantly above the 2007-2008 highs. For example, we just listed and closed a 2-bedroom Beechwood for $549, which is the highest price ever obtained by a 2-bedroom Beechwood and is 46% over the highest sale in 2007 or 2008. Another example is a Piper Dunes that we listed and closed for 27% over the 2007-2008 highs for Piper Dunes. And this isn't just limited to condos. We're seeing similar price increases in single-family homes and in all of our markets. So if you have any interest in selling, the Miller Group would be happy to assist. Even if you just plan to sell in the next few years, it would be worthwhile to receive an update evaluation on your property's value in today's market. You might be surprised at how much it's worth today. If we can assist you in any way, please give us a call at 904-557-5720. And without further ado, let's start the interview with Jason Hambrecht.
Well, I know most of you are aware of the tragic events that took place at the Surfside condominium in South Florida last year, where I think 98 people lost their lives with the collapse of a part of the condominium structure. And many of you, of our listeners, have either live in a high-rise condo here on the ocean, have family or friends that do, or are considering buying a property, and have a lot of questions that have kind of come up as a result of that. And today we have a unique opportunity to talk with an individual who is highly qualified to give us some background and thoughts on maybe what happened there at Surfside, but maybe more importantly, what it kind of means to your association, to your board, your condo board, what they should be thinking about, and those types of questions. And today we're joined by Jason Hambrecht, who's President and CEO of Construction Solutions, Inc. And Jason, welcome to the Miller Group Real Estate Show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Let's start off, Jason. Give us some background on kind of your personal background, and then also about Construction Solutions.
Okay, yeah, I started at the bottom of the food chain in this industry as a landscaper back probably over 20 years ago, and got into property management. So I was a community association manager for several years, and I used to hire Construction Solutions on the properties that I managed, and eventually got offered a job, which I turned down twice, but I eventually took it. And about 7 years after that, I ended up purchasing the company and partnering with Jeff Sellers, my partner who's a structural engineer, and the rest is history. We've been going strong ever since. CSI has been in business since 1995, so over 25 years now. Yeah, in the area, on the plantation, on the island. I think once the first job CSI had was right after Sandcastles was built. CSI helped them through their lawsuit. They had a lawsuit back then, I think about the windows or something like that. But yeah, we've been around for a while. And we essentially specialize in condominiums. We work on some commercial buildings, but we specialize in what you would call the exterior envelope of buildings, which is the skin, windows, roofs, foundation, doors. And that's all we really do. We don't get into a lot of electrical. We get into some plumbing and some electrical, but we mainly focus on the structure of buildings, the waterproofing, mainly the common elements of the building. We don't really get into like remodeling of units or anything like that. Now we do remodel the exteriors of buildings quite often. You know, we inspect them, develop plans and specifications for repairs and updating, and we do specifications and drawings, and it ends up being, in some cases, a complete facelift of a building. A few on the island like that. We've done quite a few in Jacksonville and St. Simons that we've just completely redone the exterior of the building. But yeah, that's what we do. And we're based here on Amelia Island. We've got an office in Ponte Vedra, and we go from North Carolina down to essentially Orlando, you know, sometimes a little bit further south. But 80% of what we do is on Amelia Island and in Jacksonville.
You know, it's interesting, you talk about the outer envelope of a structure. I've heard you speak about that before, and it kind of makes sense relative to if you can protect that, you protect the internal structures that are there. Talk a little bit about, as you relate it back to Surfside, and what happened there, and was that kind of a causal factor of why things started to deteriorate?
Yeah, so the Surfside situation, obviously right now they're in several lawsuits, and there are a number of different experts with different opinions based on whose side they're on and all of that sort of thing. But the consensus is that the waterproofing on the pool deck wasn't maintained. They had a pool deck with pavers on it, and come to find out, under those pavers were I think another set of pavers, and under that, over the years they had, when they redid their pool, they didn't remove what was there and redo the waterproofing. They'd sort of try to patch it to save money because it's expensive to take everything off. So over the years, they just kind of stacked on top of what was previously there. And beneath that pool deck was a parking garage. And the pool deck was ponding at one of the ends of it. Water was pooling there. Well, underneath all those pavers was a giant mess of corroding rebar and cracking concrete that they could see from the garage, but they were actually in the process of fixing this when this tragedy happened. But it was just, if they would have had proper waterproofing on their pool deck, they would probably be okay. But because they didn't, water was getting into the concrete, coming in contact with the reinforcing steel, which causes it to rust, corrode, and expand. And when it does that, it cracks the concrete. And it's
is that the sparring, the term I hear about sparring? Spalling.
Yeah. And it's sort of a domino effect after that. And there's a couple of theories on why it happened at this building. There's a claim that some work was done by the property next door, and they damaged one of the walls a little bit. I don't think we'll ever know for sure exactly what happened, but the consensus is that waterproofing failed and slowly deteriorated the concrete, and eventually the columns beneath started to fail. And I did read that when the building was constructed, it was improperly calculated. There were 24-inch columns in some areas and 12-inch columns under the pool, and it was under designed to begin with. But they probably would have been okay if they just would have maintained the waterproofing properly, and none of this would have happened. And I like to look at, that's sort of an example, it's a large example of a smaller scale situation that a lot of condo owners are faced with. The Surfside thing kind of correlates to balconies at a lot of condos. East-facing oceanfront balconies are supposed to have waterproofing, and it's supposed to be maintained. Most of them do, particularly in this area. We're actually working on a building on the island right now that they're putting it on for the first time. But it's a similar situation. We've worked on a couple, I don't want to name names with condo associations, but we did work on a building on the plantation 5 or 6 years ago where they had to take off several of their balconies completely off the building. Some of it was waterproofing issues. Some of it was complete lack of steel in the concrete from the original construction. And we discovered it by accident. We used what's called a ground penetrating radar, GPR, and we were scanning for something. I think there was a leak. And on one of the balconies, we found that there was no steel at all. And that was a little worrisome. So we ended up scanning all the balconies. It was a pretty big undertaking because it takes some time to do that. And I think we found half a dozen, maybe a dozen balconies that didn't have any steel holding the balconies to the sides of the building. So those all had to be pulled down. But waterproofing is extremely important. Not only, there's obviously always the chance of a collapse, but on a smaller scale, there's concrete spalling like we talked about, and at first it becomes an aesthetic issue, but it can become a structural issue. And without that waterproofing, time is not your friend. So the faster it's waterproofed, the less long-term damage you're going to have. So when we go to a property and they don't have any waterproofing, and they don't want to maybe pay for it right away, hey, how much longer can we just stretch this out, and how really
help me understand too, when you say if they don't have any waterproofing, what would that mean? When a structure didn't have it, what does it look? How do you determine that?
Sure. So you essentially have either a concrete slab or wood framing. Back in the 70s and 80s, they just left the concrete slab, sometimes stained it, and sometimes put like exterior carpet on it. We see a lot of exterior carpet, which is terrible because it actually holds moisture. And then other times people will just install tile onto the concrete without any waterproofing. So water can still get through the grout and into the building. So there's different types of scenarios with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of the projects we work on, regularly all have proper waterproofing, and they maintain it. It has to be redone, every several years. Some of the buildings, if you put tile over the waterproofing, it protects it for longer because it's not exposed to ultraviolet light.
Right.
Yeah, waterproofing on balconies is, Surfside the pool area was almost like a balcony scenario. That could happen to a building, a balcony on a building. The same thing could happen. Water gets in there over time, spalling happens. People don't know what they're looking at. A condo owner, it's cracked, they'll try to caulk it, or they don't know what they're seeing, and bad things can happen. So.
It's for people that are, it seems like that, are there not codes that say that you have to do certain waterproofing techniques when you construct a building, or were there just not at a certain time frame and now there are? How,
They're vague on this topic. You really should have everything sealed. There is something in the code that says any penetrations need to be sealed. Is a balcony a penetration? It's or is a balcony in some cases considered a roof because the balcony below it's its roof? I've had to argue this. We do expert witness work, and I had to argue this in a case one time, and we ended up determining that balconies were essentially roofs, and roofs have to be waterproof. But there's all sorts of waterproofing on a building. There's caulk around windows. There's the cladding of the building, whether it's stucco or ephes, which is like a synthetic stucco. When these walls are put up, they typically don't put a waterproofing membrane on them, and you really don't need them the first couple of years. But after you get down the road a couple of years, you want to seal those exterior walls because stucco can crack. And a building could be concrete, and it's the same scenario as a balcony. The concrete could crack, and what the waterproofing membrane does, it's a flexible elastomeric material that stretches. It's like a rubber glove. So if you coat an entire building with this waterproofing membrane, you're essentially putting a rubber glove on it. And then you get into penetrations in walls, like a dryer vent through a wall, or some kind of vent in the side of the building. A lot of times they're not sealed. Hose bibs.
Yeah.
There's anything that basically you should sort of think of, can you dip this building underwater and not have it leak,
Have it
you
leak.
know.
Right.
And if there are any cracks or penetrations that would, then they should be sealed, because you don't know how long they've been there for or what's going on behind the walls, etc.
So we're now, as we move this forward, and we have obviously a lot of listeners who live in high-rise towers or people considering it, what should they be doing? What should a board be doing these days to better prepare their building and the residents that live there so that that it's a safe structure and to move it forward? What are the steps that they need to be considering?
If they haven't had their building or buildings looked at in the past, it really depends on the age of the building, you know. But we recommend looking at buildings every 2 to 3 years. You really want that initial evaluation, especially in an older building, and there's some legislation in the works right now that's probably going to require that. But you want an initial evaluation done by an engineering firm or an architectural firm that identifies all of these areas, the waterproofing, any issues with the roofs, and then you've got sort of a template to work from. You know, when we do these reports, there's a lot in them a lot of times, and not everything needs to be done right away. So, you know, we'll put in the report, we'll list it in order of importance. Some things need to be done immediately, such as, you know, loose handrails on a building. We see that a lot. So those are the types of things that need to be done right away. And sometimes waterproofing can wait. You know, we'll look at a building and say, you're okay, you know, the next 2 or 3 years, you might want to re-waterproof or initially waterproof your buildings, but you've got time. And then there's things down the road, you know, your roofs have 10 years. But a lot of condo associations wait until they start, the buildings are essentially a mess. They see a lot of cracking and they're having leaks. And we come and look at it and do a report, and they're sort of stuck with a bunch of work at once. Yeah. And obviously that gets expensive. Right now, there will be new rules that are coming out.
In the Florida legislature?
Yeah, because of the Surfside collapse. Yeah. Let me get this right. Right now, in Miami-Dade and Broward counties, they have what's called a 40-year inspection. And that essentially entails all the stuff I talked about, inspecting the structure, the waterproofing, roofs, windows. They want you to look at the electrical and plumbing. And I've pulled up some of the reports from South Florida, and they're very weak. The reports are not very detailed. There's just a form people are filling out down there. And, you know, and the new legislation is going to require reports, let me get this right, inspections, once a building is 30 years old and every 10 years thereafter, unless the building is within 3 miles of the coastline, which is a lot of the buildings on Amelia. Buildings that are within 3 miles of the coastline and assumed to be more vulnerable to the corrosive effects of sea salt are required to be inspected every 20 years and then every 10 years thereafter. So it looks like that's going to become a requirement. They've tossed around these years. The Senate had 20 years and 7 years. The House has 25 years and 10 years, but all that's in the mix right now. So that'll be sort of the minimum standard moving forward. But looking at a building every 10 years probably isn't sufficient. It really depends. So if you've got a 40-year-old building, you probably need to have it looked at every 2 years, every 3 years. If you've got a 10-year-old building that's in great shape, you can stretch it out a little bit longer, 3 or 4 years.
So that kind of falls into where most of our structures here on Amelia are in that 10 to 20 year range.
Yeah.
I would assume most of the calls that you used to get were to come kind of look at a problem, to help address a problem. Are you now getting calls, or do you think you will be, relative to come help us assess where we are, evaluate our building, let's do so that we can kind of get ahead of the problems before they develop?
Yeah, so the Surfside collapse scared a lot of people. We've been getting calls from hundreds of condo associations all throughout Northeast Florida. You know, we work regularly with a lot of our clients, some of them, 25 years. And a lot of our clients keep up with their buildings for the most part. You know, they have us look at them every couple of years. So a lot of our clients are sort of on this path already, but we have been getting calls from other condos that haven't looked at their buildings in 10 years. Nobody's looked at them maybe ever. And we're working on a few right now that are just, a mess. They're fixable, they're not necessarily unsafe, but if they don't get on top of them, it's going to continue to get worse. And like I said earlier, the longer you wait, really the more expensive it gets, particularly with how construction costs are going up right now. But if you've got a leak in a balcony, or if you have leaking balconies and they're just leaking, they've only been leaking for a year, there's maybe some concrete damage, it's pretty easy to get a handle on. But if it's 5, 6 years, 10 years that this has been going on, you're into some serious problems and serious work. But there's we do look at different components of buildings. So we'll do a complete building evaluation a lot of times, but other times people will say, hey, can you come look at our roofs? Our roofs are 10 years old. We waterproofed our buildings a year ago, but we haven't really done anything with the roof. Can you look at that? So there's every building has its own sort of personality.
It's interesting. It seems to me where these buildings and HOAs and boards get in trouble is if they don't do a reserve study early on, determine the useful life of the various aspects of the building, and then start funding the repair costs ahead of time so that when those needs come up, the funds are there. I know you work with HOAs to help on reserve studies. I think you do that.
We do. We used to do them more often. There are a lot of companies that specialize in reserve studies, and we can do them. It's just not really our focus. But right now, a condo association can waive funding their reserves, and a lot of condo associations do that. It looks like that may be another change that's coming. But you end up in a situation where you get a couple of board members that are maybe investors from out of state, and they're only going to own their unit for a year, and they're on the board. They don't want to fully fund and raise their monthly assessment, and that's been problematic. So I think that's going to change, and it's going to be a big deal if they require every condo association in Florida to fully fund their reserves. You have condo associations that have been waiving their reserves for literally decades, and they just pay for things with a special assessment from time to time. But if all of a sudden everybody needs fully funded reserves, they're going to have that study done, and assessments are going to increase.
Are there any indication that legislation is coming to address that issue?
There is, and I even saw something with some of the big lenders that they will not loan, they won't approve a loan if the condo association where the unit belongs isn't fully funded.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen is these laws are likely going to go into place. Probably a lot of people won't realize it's happening until you have a building where one of the unit owners sells it or tries to sell it, goes to sell their unit, and the buyer has to deal with all this with their lender. And then the association, maybe hasn't had the reserve study done, doesn't have fully funded reserves. I don't know how that plays out.
Yeah, I can see it playing out with both lenders and with insurance aspects. We already see this kind of in single-family homes. If roofs get to be a certain age, that they don't want to insure roofs that are past 20 years old, let's say. You can certainly see scenarios with lenders not wanting to lend unless there's a clear demonstration of funding that has been made and following reserve studies. I could see this really getting tighter, and buyers wanting to know from associations, where exactly does this association stand? What have you done? What's the history? What's the board saying? Right now you have to it's hard sometimes to get that information.
Yeah, so it's sort of a complex situation because CAMs and property managers, they're going to have to stay on top of this. And again, if a condo association isn't fully funded and they get a reserve study back that says you need to, per unit, this is going to be $1,200 a month extra at assessments, and I don't know, it'll play itself out, but it's going to be interesting to see how it does.
Yeah, no question. It'll be interesting too to see really where the legislature, what they come out. I guess that would be in the next few months. We'll know how that plays out for this year and what new requirements they'll put on HOA boards. It's being an HOA board member becomes more challenging too. It has been, I know, I have served in that role, so I have kind of an appreciation of it. And you are, as you say, you're quite often, these owners are only there for a limited period of time and they're serving on these boards. They might not have the kind of background to make these types of decisions. It's a challenging thing to be a board member. And I was interested because you mentioned you have the property manager background before you got more into the construction side. Talk a little bit about that aspect too, for what this means to HOA boards.
Well, I think, and this isn't marketing, but I think companies like ours are really going to have to get a lot more involved, because board members aren't qualified to really look at things and even put reserve studies together. And it's a volunteer position. Nobody wants a full-time job, so it's going to put more weight on the property managers. And but property managers aren't necessarily qualified to evaluate buildings and really evaluate reserves to a certain degree. So yeah, it's gonna take a lot of restructuring of how buildings are managed, because this isn't something you can't sweep under the rug, because you're gonna have people buying and selling units, and every time that happens, this scenario is gonna play out again, where the lender or the insurance company is gonna say, "Where's all your stuff? Where's your
the disclosure?"
Yeah, and they want to know if there's any lawsuits, and so it's almost like more complex disclosures. And yeah, property managers are just going to have to be more involved with keeping these records. And another thing that the legislation is talking about doing is all of these reports need to go to every single unit owner. Mm. So right now and in the past, typically when we do a building evaluation report, it just goes to the board. The board has meetings, everybody's invited to attend, but most of the time only a certain percentage of people show up. But now it looks like they're going to require sending these building evaluation reports out to all of the owners. So I would imagine that even puts more stress on a board member, because if you're in a 100-unit condo and you send out a report, there's going to be all kinds of questions from individual owners, and it's going to be interesting for sure.
Well, there's no doubt one thing that's for sure is that you're going to be busy. I think there's so much demand for professional types of service that you bring, and there are only a limited number of companies that have the kind of engineering and structural background that you guys bring, and it means a lot to a board to have this kind of evaluation and to prospective buyers, and it's the whole transparency issue that's really going to have to come forward in relative to where a building stands, and those that do it right from a property value standpoint, it's going to add value to those complexes. So I think it's something that we're all going to be. It'll be a big change as we head towards the next several years. And I'll kind of let you finish up any final thoughts that you have relative to all of this.
Fortunately for us, this is what we've been doing for so long. It's just adding to the workload a little bit, but we're not really having to learn new things and adapt in any major way. For us, it's just more of what we've been doing, and so yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see over the next year when all this plays out.
Well, I know you've been a great help to a number of associations at Amelia Island Plantation that I'm aware of, and we appreciate all that CSI has done, and appreciate your time today and your expertise on this. And we hope.
How can people get in touch with you if they want to hire you or to your company to assess their condo association?
Sure, yeah, it's csidesign.com, and my email address is jason@csidesign.com. So, and I appreciate you having me.
Jason, thank you. Appreciate you joining us today, and thanks to all our listeners.